Have you ever had a moment when you felt like giving up on everything, your dreams, your relationship, even the life you moved across the world to build? I once stood in that exact moment in the United States, tired, confused, and ready to quit. But one unexpected moment changed everything. In this story, I'll share how love, struggle, and a simple realization quietly rebuilt my life. The night I almost gave up. Some nights look peaceful on the outside, but inside your mind, everything feels loud. That night in America was exactly like that. Outside the small apartment window, the street was quiet. A cold wind moved gently through the trees, and the yellow streetlight painted long shadows across the empty road. It looked calm. It looked simple. But inside my mind, nothing felt calm at all. I was sitting alone at a small kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. The clock on the wall moved slowly, second by second. Midnight had already passed, but sleep refused to come. Life in the United States had only just begun for me back then. From the outside, it sounded like a dream. Friends back home often said the same thing. "You're lucky. America must be exciting." Sometimes I smiled when I heard that. Because the truth was very different. Moving to another country is a strange experience. It feels a little like becoming a child again. Suddenly everything is new. The weather feels different. The food tastes unfamiliar. Even the way people greet each other can feel confusing. And when the language around you moves faster than your thoughts, the world can suddenly feel very big. Earlier that day, something small had happened. A very normal moment. The kind of moment most people would forget in 5 minutes. But for me, it stayed in my mind the entire night. I had gone to a grocery store near my apartment. The store was bright and clean, with quiet music playing somewhere above the shelves. People moved quickly through the aisles, pushing carts filled with vegetables, milk, and bread. Everything looked ordinary. When I finished paying for my groceries, the cashier asked a simple question. "Paper or plastic?" The words were easy. I had studied them before. Anyone learning English knows those words. But in that moment, my brain froze. Paper. Plastic. Two simple choices. Yet my mind suddenly went blank. For 1 or 2 seconds, I just stood there looking at her. Behind me, the line slowly grew longer. The cashier waited patiently, but I could see a small look of confusion on her face. Finally I answered, slowly and quietly. "Plastic, please." The moment lasted only a few seconds. But moments like that can stay with you much longer when you already feel uncertain about everything. Walking back to the apartment, the plastic bag felt heavier than it should have. Not because of the groceries, but because of the thoughts in my mind. Living in America was supposed to be a new beginning. But that evening, it felt more like standing at the bottom of a very tall mountain. And I was not sure if I could climb it. Inside the apartment, the silence felt even deeper. No familiar voices. No family sounds in the background. Just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock. Loneliness has a strange way of entering a room. It does not knock on the door. It simply sits beside you. Researchers from several universities in the United States have studied this feeling carefully. Their studies show that when people move to a completely new environment, the brain works much harder than usual. Every sound, every conversation, every social signal requires more attention. Over time, this constant effort can create mental fatigue. In simple words, your brain becomes tired. And when the brain becomes tired, it tries to protect itself. Not by encouraging you to continue, but by offering an easier idea. Maybe you should stop. That thought is very persuasive when you are alone. That night, sitting at that small kitchen table, I heard that thought clearly. Maybe this dream was too big. Maybe life here was not meant for me. Maybe going back would be easier. Many people who start something difficult experience this moment. Athletes feel it during long training seasons. Students feel it when studying late at night. Immigrants feel it while building a new life far away from home. Psychologists call it a motivation dip. It is the moment when effort feels larger than hope. And that night, the dip felt very deep. The coffee in front of me had already turned cold. I took a small sip anyway. The bitter taste matched the mood perfectly. For a long time, I simply stared at the wall. Then a strange thought appeared. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a quiet question. What if this difficult moment is not a sign to quit, but a sign that something important is beginning? The idea felt almost ridiculous at first. Nothing about that day had been successful. No big progress. No exciting opportunity. Just a confusing moment in a grocery store. But sometimes the beginning of change does not look impressive. Sometimes it looks like a person sitting alone in a small apartment, wondering what to do next. Neuroscience research explains something interesting about moments like this. When the brain faces difficulty but continues trying, new neural connections slowly begin to form. Scientists call this neuroplasticity. In simple language, the brain is quietly learning how to adapt. But adaptation does not feel comfortable at first. It feels messy, confusing, slow. That night, I did not understand any of that science yet. All I knew was this simple decision. Tomorrow, I would try again. Not perfectly. Not confidently. Just one more small attempt. I stood up from the table and walked toward the window. The street outside was still empty. The cold wind moved gently through the branches of the trees. Nothing had changed in the outside world. But inside my mind, something small had shifted. A tiny piece of determination had returned. At that time, I had no idea that one moment in the near future would change everything about how I saw life in America. A moment so simple that most people might not even notice it. But sometimes the smallest moments become the biggest turning points. And that moment was slowly getting closer. Believe it or not. My first real days in America. Morning in America can feel strangely quiet when your life is still new there. The first few weeks after arriving in the United States felt exactly like that. The mornings were bright, the sky often wide and clear, but inside my mind everything still felt unfamiliar. Every sound seemed different. Cars moved faster than I expected. People walked quickly, always with purpose. Even the way strangers greeted each other felt unusual. In many places, someone might smile and say a simple, "Good morning," even if they had never met you before. At first, I did not know how to react. Sometimes I smiled back. Sometimes I answered too late. Sometimes I just nodded politely and kept walking. Living in a new country often feels like watching a movie without subtitles. You understand some parts clearly, but other moments move too fast. One morning, not long after that difficult night I told you about earlier, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. The air was cool. It was early spring, and the trees were just beginning to show small green leaves. The streets looked calm and organized. Houses stood quietly beside each other with small gardens in front. Some people were already outside walking their dogs or jogging slowly along the sidewalk. Everything looked peaceful. But inside my mind, questions kept appearing. How do people build a life here? How do they feel so comfortable? How long will it take before this place feels normal to me? Researchers who study cultural adaptation say something interesting about this stage. When someone moves to a new country, they often experience what psychologists call culture shock. It usually happens in several stages. At first, everything feels exciting and new. That is the honeymoon stage. But after some time, reality becomes clearer. Small difficulties appear. Communication becomes tiring. Everyday tasks require more effort. That stage is called the frustration stage. And during my first weeks in America, I was definitely inside that stage. Even simple activities felt like small challenges. Ordering food. Understanding casual conversations. Listening to people speak quickly with expressions I had never heard before. One afternoon, I walked into a small sandwich shop near the apartment. The place smelled wonderful. Fresh bread, grilled meat, and coffee filled the air. The menu board above the counter had many options. Turkey sandwich. Chicken sandwich. Vegetarian wrap. Everything looked delicious. But ordering felt surprisingly complicated. The employee behind the counter spoke quickly but kindly. What kind of bread? What toppings? What sauce would you like? My brain worked very hard trying to follow each question. I answered slowly. Sometimes I needed the person to repeat a question. Sometimes I simply pointed to the menu and smiled. Finally, I sat down at a small table with my sandwich. The food tasted good, but I remember laughing quietly to myself. Back home, ordering food had never required so much concentration. Moments like that may sound small, but they teach something important. Real-life language is very different from textbook language. In many classrooms, people learn perfect grammar and clear sentences. But everyday English in America is often faster, shorter, and full of expressions. People say things like, "Sounds good." "No worries." "I got you." For a new learner, these phrases can feel confusing at first. But slowly, the brain begins to recognize patterns. Linguists explain that language learning happens most effectively when the brain hears repeated, meaningful input in real situations. This idea is known as comprehensible input. In simple terms, the brain learns best when it hears language connected to real life. And living in America provided that experience every single day. Still, the emotional part of adaptation was not easy. Some evenings felt lonely. Family was far away. Friends were far away. Sometimes the apartment felt too quiet. During those quiet evenings, I began a small habit. Nothing complicated. Just a simple routine. I started writing short notes about each day. What I saw. What I heard. What confused me. What made me smile. Some days the notes were only 3 or 4 sentences long. But something interesting started to happen. Writing those small reflections made the experiences feel lighter. The mistakes became stories instead of problems. Psychologists often explain that storytelling helps the brain organize difficult experiences. When you tell your story, even privately, the brain begins to process emotions more calmly. Looking back now, those simple notes became the beginning of a much larger journey. At the time, they were just small observations about life in America. The sound of morning traffic. The taste of coffee from a local cafe. The way strangers held the door open for each other. Little by little, the unfamiliar world started becoming slightly more understandable. Not perfect. Not easy. But less frightening. One evening, while reading through those short daily notes, I noticed something surprising. Even on the hardest days, there was always at least one positive moment. A friendly smile. A helpful stranger. A simple conversation that went better than expected. Those small moments were easy to overlook. But they were slowly building confidence. At the time, I still had no idea that one particular moment, one simple meeting in a very ordinary place, was about to change the direction of my life in America. Not through something dramatic. Not through luck. But through something very human. A conversation. And sometimes, one honest conversation can change everything. The small mistake I still remember. Embarrassing moments have a strange power. They arrive suddenly, stay longer than expected, and sometimes teach lessons that no classroom ever could. One particular moment from my early days in the United States still lives clearly in my memory. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was painfully simple. It happened on a quiet Saturday afternoon. The weather was bright and slightly warm, one of those comfortable American afternoons when the sky feels wide and calm. I had decided to visit a small public library near my neighborhood. Libraries in the United States are special places. They are quiet, welcoming, and open to everyone. You do not need to buy anything. You can simply walk in, sit down, and read. For someone adjusting to a new life, a library can feel like a peaceful refuge. The building was not large, but it looked warm and inviting. Tall windows allowed sunlight to fill the room. Rows of bookshelves stretched quietly across the floor. A few people were sitting at tables, reading or working on laptops. The air smelled faintly like paper and coffee. I remember walking slowly between the shelves, looking at book titles and practicing reading them quietly in my mind. Reading felt easier than speaking. Words on paper move at your speed. Conversations do not. After spending some time exploring, I decided to borrow a book. I carried it to the front desk where a librarian stood behind a computer. She looked friendly and relaxed. "Hi there," she said with a warm smile. I smiled back and handed her the book. Everything was going well so far. Then she asked a simple question. "Do you have a library card?" The sentence was clear. I understood the words. But my brain suddenly started working too fast. Instead of answering calmly, I tried to respond quickly. I wanted to sound confident. So I said something strange. "I don't have a card, but I have money." For a moment, the librarian looked surprised. Then she laughed gently. Not in a mean way. Not to embarrass me. Just a natural laugh, the kind people make when something unexpected happens. "You don't need money for a library card," she said kindly. "It's free." My face became warm instantly. Of course it was free. Libraries are public services in many American communities. But at that moment, I had been thinking about payment because many other things in daily life required money. The mistake was small. But in that moment, it felt huge. My brain immediately replayed the sentence again and again. Why did I say that? Why didn't I answer more clearly? Why does my English disappear exactly when I need it? Many language learners experience this exact feeling. Linguists explain that when people speak a second language in real situations, the brain often experiences what is called performance anxiety. The brain knows the words, but stress blocks access to them temporarily. It is like having a book in your mind but suddenly forgetting where you placed it. Standing there at the library desk, I felt that familiar mixture of embarrassment and frustration. But something interesting happened next. The librarian did not rush me. She simply smiled and explained the process slowly. "All you need is an address and an ID," she said. Her voice was calm and patient. I filled out a short form. She printed a small plastic card and handed it to me. "Welcome to the library," she said. 3 simple words. Welcome to the library. But those words felt surprisingly meaningful. Walking out of the building later, I realized something important. The moment that had embarrassed me was actually very small. The world had not stopped. No one was judging me. The librarian had simply helped me and continued with her day. Psychologists often explain a concept called the spotlight effect. It means humans tend to believe that other people notice our mistakes much more than they actually do. In reality, most people are busy thinking about their own lives. Our small mistakes are rarely as important to others as they feel to us. That realization changed something in my thinking. Maybe mistakes were not signs of failure. Maybe they were signs of participation. Because the truth is simple. If you never make mistakes while speaking, it probably means you are not speaking very much. Real communication is messy. It includes pauses, corrections, misunderstandings, and laughter. And that afternoon at the library, I walked home carrying more than just a borrowed book. I carried a new perspective. Instead of fearing every mistake, I started observing them with curiosity. What happened? Why did my brain react that way? What could I try next time? Scientists who study learning often explain that the brain improves faster when mistakes are treated as feedback instead of failure. Each mistake provides information that helps the brain adjust its patterns. In other words, mistakes are not roadblocks. They are directions. Later that evening, I wrote about the experience in my small daily notebook. The story looked funny on paper. I tried to pay for a free library card. Reading it again made me laugh. For the first time since arriving in America, the confusion of learning felt slightly lighter. Not easy, but manageable. And strangely enough, that small visit to the library started another chain of events in my life. Because a few days later, while reading quietly in that same building, would notice someone sitting at the table nearby. Someone who would eventually become much more important than I could possibly imagine at that moment. But that story had not begun yet. At that time, it was simply another quiet afternoon in America. And the next unexpected chapter was already waiting. A quiet change inside me. Change rarely arrives like a loud storm. Most of the time, it enters quietly, like sunlight slowly moving across the floor in the morning. During those early weeks in America, something small inside me had started to shift. Not a dramatic transformation. Not a sudden success story. Just a gentle change in the way I looked at each day. Life was still unfamiliar. The streets were still new. Conversations were still difficult. But my reaction to these things was beginning to change. That quiet change started with a very simple habit. Each evening, before going to sleep, would write a few lines in a small notebook. Nothing fancy. Just short reflections about the day. What I saw. What surprised me. What confused me. And sometimes, what made me smile. At first the notes were simple. Today I walked to the grocery store. I heard a new phrase, no worries. People here hold the door open for strangers. Small observations like these slowly became pieces of a bigger story. Scientists who study human behavior say that writing about daily experiences helps the brain organize emotions. When thoughts move from the mind onto paper, they often become clearer. Psychologists call this process emotional processing. In simple terms, writing helps the brain breathe. And little by little, that notebook started helping me see my situation differently. Instead of focusing only on the difficulties, I began noticing the quiet kindness around me. A stranger holding the door open. A cashier patiently repeating a question. A neighbor smiling while walking their dog. These moments were small, but they were everywhere. America suddenly felt less like a giant challenge and more like a place filled with ordinary people living ordinary lives. One afternoon, while sitting near the window of my apartment, I noticed something interesting. Across the street, a father was teaching his young daughter how to ride a bicycle. The little girl looked nervous. The bike moved slowly and wobbled from side to side. The father ran beside her, one hand gently holding the back of the seat. "Keep going," he said calmly. "You're doing great." The girl tried again. The bike shook a little. She almost stopped. But the father encouraged her once more. "Don't look down. Look forward." Eventually, after several attempts, she moved a few meters without falling. Her laughter filled the street. Watching that moment felt strangely meaningful. Learning something new always looks messy at the beginning. Nobody rides a bicycle perfectly on the first try. Nobody plays the piano perfectly on the first day. And nobody speaks a new language perfectly during their first conversations. Yet for some reason, adults often expect themselves to succeed immediately. When progress feels slow, the brain becomes impatient. Behavioral psychologists explain that adults often struggle with something called fixed mindset. It is the belief that ability should appear quickly. When results do not come fast enough, motivation drops. Children, however, often show the opposite attitude. They fall. They laugh. They try again. That small scene outside the window stayed in my mind for a long time. Maybe learning English was not supposed to feel smooth and easy. Maybe it was supposed to look exactly like that little girl riding her bicycle. Wobbly. Uncertain. But moving forward anyway. That realization removed a quiet pressure from my mind. Instead of asking myself, "Why am I not better yet?" I began asking a different question. What small step can I try today? Some days the step was very small. Reading one page of a book. Listening carefully to a short conversation. Writing a few sentences about the day. These actions did not feel impressive. But neuroscience explains something powerful about small, repeated actions. The brain changes through repetition. Every time we practice something, tiny neural connections become stronger. Over time, these connections form new pathways. This ability of the brain is called neuroplasticity. It means the brain is constantly reshaping itself through experience. So even when progress feels invisible, the brain is quietly adapting. That idea gave me patience. Life in America was still full of surprises. Sometimes funny ones. Sometimes confusing ones. But instead of seeing every challenge as proof that I did not belong, I started seeing them as part of the learning process. And slowly, something else began to change. The fear of making mistakes became smaller. The curiosity about people became larger. That curiosity would soon lead me to a moment I did not expect at all. A simple afternoon. A familiar place. And a quiet meeting with someone sitting at a nearby table. At that moment, neither of us knew that a casual conversation was about to begin. A conversation that would slowly connect two completely different lives. And many years later, when I look back at that day, I realize something surprising. That ordinary moment was the beginning of the story that would change everything. Believe it or not, the next chapter of my life was about to start in the most unexpected place. A coffee shop. The unexpected coffee shop meeting. Some of the most important moments in life begin in very ordinary places. Not on a stage. Not during a big event. Just in quiet places where people pass by each other every day without thinking much about it. For me, that place was a small coffee shop. It stood on the corner of a calm street about 10 minutes from my apartment. The building was simple, with large glass windows and a wooden door that made a soft sound every time someone walked in. Inside, the air always smelled like fresh coffee beans and warm bread. Soft music played in the background. A few people usually sat at small tables, working on laptops or reading books. It was the kind of place where time seemed to move a little slower. During those early weeks in America, I started visiting that coffee shop often. Not because I was a coffee expert. In fact, at that time I still felt confused by the many choices on the menu. Espresso. Latte. Cappuccino. Americano. The names sounded familiar, but I was never completely sure what the differences were. So most days I ordered the simplest option. Small coffee, please. The employees there began to recognize me after a few visits. They greeted me with friendly smiles, and gradually the place started to feel comfortable. One quiet afternoon, I entered the coffee shop and ordered my usual drink. The weather outside was cool, and the sky looked slightly gray. It was one of those calm afternoons when people seemed to move more slowly. I took my cup of coffee and looked around for a place to sit. Most of the tables were empty. Except for one small table near the window where someone was already sitting. She was reading a book. At first, I did not pay much attention. I simply chose a seat at the table next to hers and opened the small notebook I had been carrying with me everywhere. That notebook had become my daily companion. Inside it were small observations about life in America. New words. Funny situations. Short reflections about each day. While I was writing, something unexpected happened. A soft voice came from the table next to me. "That's an interesting notebook." I looked up. She was smiling politely. For a brief moment, my brain reacted in the usual way it often did during those early days. Panic. What should I say? Did I understand her correctly? Should I answer quickly or slowly? But this time, something inside me remained calm. Maybe because the environment felt relaxed. Maybe because the conversation had started naturally. So I answered simply. "It's my daily notes." She looked curious. About what? I thought for a moment. About living here, I said. Everything still feels new. She nodded with understanding. That makes sense. Her voice sounded friendly, not rushed. The kind of voice that makes conversations feel easy. A few seconds passed before she asked another question. Are you new to the United States? Yes, I said. Still learning many things. She laughed softly. Honestly, most of us are still learning too. That sentence surprised me. Until that moment, I had often assumed that everyone around me completely understood how life worked here. But hearing her say that reminded me of something simple. No one has life fully figured out. Everyone is learning something. The conversation continued slowly. We talked about small things at first. The weather. The neighborhood. The coffee shop. I noticed something interesting during that conversation. She did not speak too fast. She listened carefully. And when I paused to find the right words, she waited patiently. Those small behaviors made communication feel easier. Linguists often explain that communication is not only about vocabulary or grammar. It is also about something called interactional support. When people listen patiently and respond kindly, the brain feels safer during conversation. And when the brain feels safe, language flows more naturally. At that table in the coffee shop, that supportive atmosphere existed without either of us planning it. Eventually, she asked about the notebook again. What kind of things do you write? I opened the notebook and showed her a page. Simple sentences. Short descriptions of daily life. The grocery store. The library. Small cultural surprises. She read a few lines and smiled. This is actually a great way to understand a new place, she said. Then she introduced herself. Her name was Emily. She had lived in the city for several years and often visited that coffee shop to read or work. The conversation lasted maybe 20 minutes. Nothing dramatic happened. No life-changing announcement. Just two people talking quietly while drinking coffee. But when I left the coffee shop that afternoon, something felt different. The city did not feel quite as distant anymore. A single friendly conversation had changed the atmosphere. Psychologists explain that positive social interactions release chemicals in the brain such as oxytocin and dopamine. These chemicals reduce stress and increase feelings of connection. In simple terms, kind conversations help people feel human again. Walking back home, I realized that the world had not suddenly become easier. But it had become warmer. That afternoon, I wrote another note in my notebook. Today I met someone named Emily. The conversation felt natural. At that moment, I had no idea that this simple meeting would slowly grow into something much more meaningful. Sometimes life changes quietly. Not through huge events, but through small conversations that open unexpected doors. And that coffee shop conversation had just opened the first one. When friendship became love. Some relationships begin loudly. Others begin so quietly that you almost miss the moment when everything starts to change. The connection between Emily and me began in the quietest way possible, with simple conversations in that same coffee shop. After our first meeting, I did not expect anything special. Life continued normally. Days were still filled with small routines, walking through the neighborhood, writing notes in my notebook, visiting the library, and sometimes stopping by the coffee shop. But about a week later, something familiar happened. I pushed open the wooden door of the coffee shop and heard the soft bell above it ring gently. The smell of coffee filled the room again. And there, sitting at the same table near the window, was Emily. She noticed me almost immediately and smiled. "Hey," she said casually. "Notebook guy." I laughed. Apparently my small notebook had already become part of my identity. "Hi," I answered. This time, sitting down and starting a conversation felt easier. The first meeting had already broken the invisible wall that often exists between strangers. So we talked again. At first, the topics were still simple. Books. Weather. Favorite places in the city. But little by little, the conversations became more personal. She asked about my hometown. I told her about the food, the streets, the way evenings felt there. In return, she shared stories about growing up in the United States and moving to this city for work. What surprised me most was how natural the conversations felt. At that time, my English was still far from perfect. I searched for words often. Sometimes I paused in the middle of a sentence to think. But Emily never seemed impatient. Instead, she listened carefully and waited. That small act of patience made a big difference. Communication experts often say that conversation is not only about speaking clearly. It is also about creating space for the other person to express themselves. And Emily had a natural way of doing that. Days slowly turned into weeks. Our meetings at the coffee shop became a quiet routine. Sometimes we met by coincidence. Other times we planned to meet after work. The conversations grew longer. We talked about cultural differences. About how people in different countries express emotions. About how families show love in different ways. One evening, while walking outside the coffee shop, Emily said something that stayed in my mind. "You see things differently," she said. I looked confused. "Differently?" She nodded. "Yes. You notice small things that most people here ignore." I smiled slightly. Maybe she was talking about the notebook again. But she continued. "You observe people carefully. You listen more than you speak. That's rare." Her words surprised me. Until that moment, I had sometimes felt that speaking less was a weakness. But hearing her describe it as something valuable made me see it differently. Psychologists explain that meaningful relationships often begin when people feel understood. When someone recognizes a part of your personality that you have not fully appreciated yourself, a deeper connection can begin to form. Looking back now, that might have been one of the first moments when friendship quietly started turning into something more. Of course, neither of us said that out loud. Life does not always announce its important moments clearly. Instead, the changes appear in small details. The way conversations last a little longer. The way laughter feels easier. The way silence between two people feels comfortable instead of awkward. One Saturday afternoon, we decided to walk through a nearby park after getting coffee. The park was beautiful. Tall trees lined the paths, and children played near a small playground. Dogs ran happily across the grass while their owners talked on benches. The air smelled fresh. As we walked, Emily asked a thoughtful question. Was it difficult leaving your home country? I thought carefully before answering. Yes, I said slowly. But sometimes difficult decisions open new paths. She nodded quietly. Then she said something that I did not expect. I'm glad you came here. The sentence was simple. But something about the way she said it made the moment feel special. Neuroscience research shows that emotional connections often develop through repeated positive interactions. Each meaningful conversation releases small amounts of dopamine in the brain, creating a sense of reward. Over time, these moments build emotional bonds. Without realizing it, those coffee shop meetings had been building exactly that. A quiet bond. A comfortable friendship. And slowly, something warmer. That evening, after walking back home, I opened my notebook again. The page looked different from the earlier ones. Before, the notes had been about confusion and adaptation. Now they included something new. Connection. I wrote one simple sentence. Sometimes the most important relationships begin in ordinary places. At that time, I still did not know how important Emily would become in my life. But one thing had become clear. America was no longer just a place filled with challenges. It had become a place where something meaningful was beginning. And the story that started with a quiet conversation in a coffee shop was only just beginning to unfold. Learning each other's world. Understanding another person is a little like learning a new country. At first, everything feels unfamiliar. The habits are different. The small details are surprising. Sometimes even simple things can create confusion. But slowly, if you stay curious and patient, the unfamiliar begins to make sense. That was exactly what was happening between Emily and me. Our conversations at the coffee shop continued week after week. At first, they were light and simple. But as time passed, the topics grew deeper. We began sharing more about our lives. About family. About childhood memories. About the different ways people grow up in different cultures. One evening, while sitting at our usual table near the window, Emily asked a question that made me pause for a moment. What was family life like where you grew up? It sounded like an easy question. But the answer carried many memories. I took a slow sip of coffee and began explaining. In my home, family dinners were important, I said. People talked for a long time. Sometimes even small meals became long conversations. Emily smiled. That sounds nice, she said. In my family, things were a little different. Everyone was busy. Dinner was often quick. Neither way was better or worse. Just different. These small conversations slowly revealed something interesting. People from different cultures often share the same values, but they express them in different ways. Love. Respect. Responsibility. These ideas exist in almost every culture. But the way people show them can look very different. Anthropologists who study culture often explain that humans learn social behavior through observation from childhood. Every society develops its own habits about communication, family roles, and emotional expression. Because of this, misunderstandings between cultures are very common. And sometimes, even small situations can create confusion. One afternoon, we experienced exactly that. Emily invited me to meet some of her friends at a casual gathering. Nothing formal, just a small group of people talking and eating together. At first, everything felt comfortable. People introduced themselves. We talked about work, hobbies, and favorite movies. But at one point, someone asked me a question about my plans for the future. The question was simple. So what do you want to do long-term here? I answered honestly. I'm still figuring that out. In my culture, that kind of answer can sound thoughtful. It shows humility and honesty. But in that moment, I noticed a slight change in the room. Some people looked surprised. Later that evening, Emily explained something gently. In America, people often talk about future plans with more confidence, she said. They don't always feel certain, but they speak as if they are. Her explanation made me laugh. So sometimes confidence is a little bit of acting? I asked. She smiled. A little bit. Moments like that became important lessons. Living in a new country is not only about learning language. It is also about understanding how people think. Psychologists often explain that communication has two layers. The first layer is words. The second layer is cultural meaning. Sometimes people understand the words perfectly, but misunderstand the intention behind them. Over time, Emily and I helped each other understand these invisible cultural layers. I explained traditions from my background. She explained small social rules that many Americans follow without even thinking about them. For example, the way people often say, "How are you?" as a greeting, even if they do not expect a long answer. Or the way neighbors sometimes talk casually while walking their dogs in the evening. These details may seem small, but they slowly build a sense of belonging. As the weeks passed, something else became clear. Our friendship was growing stronger. The conversations felt easier. The laughter came more naturally. Even silence between us began to feel comfortable. One afternoon, while sitting in the park after getting coffee, Emily looked at me and said something thoughtful. "You know something interesting?" "What?" I asked. "You came here thinking you had to understand America." I nodded. "That's true. But actually," she continued, "America is also learning about you." That sentence stayed in my mind for a long time. Often, when people move to a new country, they feel all the pressure to adapt. But relationships work both ways. Two people learning from each other create something new together. Sociologists describe this process as cultural exchange. It happens when people from different backgrounds share perspectives and gradually build mutual understanding. In simple words, both sides grow. Looking back now, that period of learning about each other was one of the most important stages of our relationship. Not because everything was easy, but because curiosity was stronger than misunderstanding. And curiosity is a powerful force. It keeps conversations alive. It keeps people open. It allows two very different lives to slowly connect. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind the buildings and the city lights began to glow, we walked quietly along the sidewalk. Neither of us said much. But the feeling was clear. Something meaningful was developing between us. At that moment, the story that had started with a simple conversation in a coffee shop was moving into a new chapter. A chapter that would soon test our relationship in ways we could not yet imagine. Because even the strongest connections eventually face challenges. And ours was no exception. When marriage faced its first storm. Every relationship has a moment and the story becomes more serious. At the beginning, everything feels light. Conversations are exciting. Differences between two people seem interesting, even charming. But real life eventually arrives. Responsibilities grow. Stress appears. Small misunderstandings slowly become larger questions. For Emily and me, that moment came after we decided to build a life together. By then, our friendship had already grown into something deeper. The quiet conversations in the coffee shop had turned into long walks, shared dinners, and honest discussions about the future. Choosing to stay together felt natural. It felt right. But building a shared life is different from simply enjoying time together. Life in the United States moves quickly. Work schedules can be demanding. Bills must be paid. Plans must be made. And sometimes, the pressure of everyday responsibilities quietly enters a relationship. At first, the changes were small. Both of us were busy with our jobs. Some evenings we came home tired. Conversations that once lasted hours became shorter. Not because we cared less. Simply because energy was limited. Psychologists often explain that many couples experience this stage. It is called the adjustment phase. During this time, partners begin balancing personal stress with shared responsibilities. If communication remains strong, relationships grow stronger. But if stress builds silently, misunderstandings can appear. One evening, after a long day, we experienced one of those misunderstandings. It was nothing dramatic. No shouting. No big argument. Just a quiet tension in the room. I had returned home later than expected. Work had been complicated, and I was mentally exhausted. Emily had prepared dinner, and I could see that she had been waiting. "Long day?" she asked. "Yes," I answered, placing my bag down. But my response was short. Too short. Emily nodded but said nothing more. We ate dinner quietly. The silence was not angry, but it felt heavy. After a few minutes, she spoke again. "You've been very distant lately." Her voice was calm, but I could hear concern inside it. At first, I did not know how to respond. Part of me wanted to explain everything. Another part of me simply felt too tired to talk. So I gave a simple answer. "I'm just busy." The conversation ended there. But the feeling remained. That night, after Emily went to sleep, I sat alone in the living room. The apartment was quiet again, just like many nights during my early days in America. But this silence felt different. This time, it was not loneliness. It was reflection. Psychologists who study relationships often explain that communication problems rarely start with big conflicts. They usually begin with small emotional distance. When stress increases, people sometimes withdraw without realizing it. The brain enters what scientists call protective mode. It focuses on solving problems individually rather than sharing emotions openly. Looking back at that evening, I realized something important. I had been carrying stress alone instead of sharing it. Emily was not asking for perfect answers. She was asking for connection. The next morning, something simple happened that changed the direction of that moment. We were preparing breakfast in the kitchen. The sunlight was entering through the window, and the smell of coffee filled the room. Emily looked a little tired. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I remembered something I had learned during my early days adapting to life in America. Small conversations can change everything. So instead of staying quiet, I said something honest. "I think I've been keeping too much in my head lately." She looked at me with curiosity. "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath. Work has been stressful. And sometimes I worry about many things at once. But I realize I stopped talking about it. Emily listened carefully. Then she smiled gently. "You know something," she said. "What?" "You don't have to carry everything alone." That sentence felt surprisingly powerful. Relationship researchers at the University of California once conducted studies on long-term couples. Their findings showed that the most stable relationships are not those without problems. They are the ones where partners continue communicating during difficult moments. In simple terms, successful relationships are not perfect. They are open. That morning, Emily and I talked for nearly an hour. About stress. About expectations. About how easy it is to forget communication when life becomes busy. The conversation was calm, honest, and surprisingly comforting. By the time we finished breakfast, the tension from the night before had disappeared. In fact, the relationship felt stronger. Because something important had happened. We had learned how to face difficulties together. And that lesson would become extremely valuable in the future. Because life was not finished testing us yet. A much bigger moment, a moment neither of us could predict, was slowly approaching. A moment that would completely change the way we looked at life, family, and our future together. A moment so simple, yet so powerful. The moment that truly changed everything. One moment changed everything. Life rarely warns you before an important moment arrives. There is no dramatic music. No flashing sign telling you that something meaningful is about to happen. Most of the time, life-changing moments look completely ordinary while they are happening. Only later do you realize their importance. For Emily and me, that moment came on a quiet evening that seemed just like many others. The day had been long. Work had kept both of us busy, and by the time we returned home the sky outside was already dark. The city lights reflected softly on the windows of nearby buildings, and the apartment felt warm and calm. Emily was standing in the kitchen preparing dinner. I remember sitting at the small table, scrolling through a few emails on my phone while the smell of food slowly filled the room. Everything felt normal. Comfortable. Predictable. And then Emily said something in a voice that sounded slightly different. "Can we talk for a minute?" The sentence was simple. But the tone made me look up immediately. "Of course," I said. She walked over and sat across from me. For a moment, she did not speak. She simply looked at me with a small smile that seemed both excited and nervous. Then she said the words that changed everything. "I have some news." My mind instantly began guessing. Maybe something related to work. Maybe something about family. But the truth was something I had not expected at all. Emily took a slow breath and said quietly, "We're going to have a baby." For a second, the room felt completely still. My brain needed a moment to process the sentence. A baby. Our baby. The words echoed in my mind as if time had slowed down. Psychologists sometimes explain that during surprising emotional events, the brain enters a brief state called cognitive pause. It is a moment when the mind stops normal thinking while it absorbs new information. That pause lasted only a few seconds. But it felt much longer. Then suddenly, many emotions arrived at the same time. Surprise. Joy. Excitement. And also a small amount of fear. Because becoming a parent is one of those moments when life suddenly becomes much bigger than your own plans. I looked at Emily again. "Really?" I asked softly. She nodded. "Yes." The smile on her face answered the question more clearly than words ever could. In that moment, something inside my mind shifted. All the worries that had once filled my thoughts, the confusion of living in a new country, the struggle of adapting to a new culture, the pressure to succeed, suddenly looked smaller. Because a new responsibility had appeared. A new life. And with that realization came a new kind of determination. Researchers who study human motivation often say that purpose is one of the strongest forces shaping behavior. When people feel responsible for something meaningful, the brain naturally increases focus and resilience. In simple terms, purpose creates energy. That evening, sitting at the kitchen table, I felt that energy begin to grow. Not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily. Emily reached across the table and held my hand. "What are you thinking?" she asked. I smiled. "I'm thinking, life just became very interesting." She laughed. And that laughter filled the room with a feeling of warmth that is difficult to describe. The rest of the evening felt different from any other evening before. We talked about many things. What the future might look like. What kind of parents we wanted to be. What kind of world we hoped our child would grow up in. None of the answers were perfect. But the conversation itself felt hopeful. Later that night, after Emily went to sleep, I sat quietly in the living room again. The same place where I had once sat during those lonely early days in America. But this time the silence felt completely different. Instead of uncertainty, there was clarity. Instead of loneliness, there was purpose. I remembered the night when I had almost given up on everything. The night when I questioned whether coming to America had been the right decision. If someone had told me then that one day I would be sitting in this apartment, thinking about becoming a father, I probably would not have believed it. Life has a strange way of unfolding. The paths that feel confusing at first sometimes lead to the most meaningful destinations. Before going to sleep, I opened my old notebook again. The same notebook that had once held short observations about cultural differences and everyday confusion. This time, I wrote something very different. One moment can change the direction of an entire life. Looking back now, that sentence was completely true. Because that quiet evening in our kitchen was not just good news. It was the beginning of a completely new chapter. A chapter filled with responsibility, learning, and a deeper understanding of what family truly means. And in the years that followed, our small family would grow in ways that neither of us could fully imagine that night. Building a family in America. Ferrant rhythm when a child enters the story. Before that moment, time often feels flexible. You wake up when you want, you make plans easily, and the future feels wide and open. But when a child arrives, something changes. Time becomes more structured. Responsibility becomes real. And suddenly, many of your decisions are no longer only about you. The months after Emily shared the news about the baby passed quickly. At the same time, they felt strangely slow, like life was preparing us step by step for something important. Our apartment slowly began to change. At first, it was small things. A few baby books on the table. Tiny clothes folded carefully inside a drawer. A small crib placed near the window. Each object felt symbolic, like a quiet reminder that a new life was about to enter our world. Emily often read articles about parenting. Sometimes she laughed while reading them. "Did you know newborn babies sleep almost 16 hours a day?" she said once. "That sounds easy," I replied jokingly. She smiled. Apparently not for the parents. Those conversations were full of excitement, but also a little uncertainty. Because no book can fully prepare someone for becoming a parent. Psychologists often describe this stage as a life transition. Major transitions, like becoming a parent, moving to a new country, or starting a new career, require the brain to reorganize priorities. The brain literally begins to focus on different things. Safety, stability, future planning. Looking back now, I can see that this transition was happening inside me as well. The same person who once felt lost in a grocery store trying to understand a simple question was now thinking about how to build a stable life for a family. It was a strange but meaningful transformation. When the baby finally arrived, everything became real very quickly. Hospitals have a unique atmosphere. The hallways are bright and quiet, but emotions inside the rooms are often intense. That day felt like a mixture of excitement, nervousness, and deep anticipation. And then, suddenly, we heard the sound that every parent remembers. A baby's first cry. It was a small sound, but it filled the entire room. Emily looked exhausted but happy. A nurse gently placed the baby in her arms. For a moment, everything else disappeared. Work stress. Daily worries. The endless questions about the future. None of those things mattered in that moment. What mattered was the tiny human being now sleeping quietly in Emily's arms. Holding my child for the first time felt almost unreal. The feeling was difficult to explain. It was a mixture of love, responsibility, and quiet determination. Researchers studying human attachment explain that when parents see their newborn child, the brain releases powerful bonding chemicals such as oxytocin. These chemicals strengthen emotional connection and increase protective instincts. In simple words, the brain immediately recognizes something important. This life matters deeply. That realization changes a person. The days that followed were both beautiful and chaotic. Newborn babies do not follow schedules. They wake up in the middle of the night. They cry unexpectedly. They require constant attention. Our quiet apartment was suddenly full of new sounds. Tiny footsteps would come later. But for now, there were soft cries, gentle lullabies, and the quiet movement of two tired parents learning a completely new routine. Sleep became rare. Coffee became essential. But strangely, happiness remained present even during the most exhausting moments. One evening, while rocking the baby to sleep, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this point. Just a few years earlier, I had sat alone in that same city, questioning whether I belonged here at all. Now I was standing in a small living room, holding my child and looking at a future that felt deeply connected to this place. Life had changed quietly but completely. Sociologists often explain that family is one of the strongest sources of identity for many people. It creates a sense of belonging that extends beyond geography or culture. In other words, family can transform a foreign place into a true home. And that was exactly what was happening. America was no longer just the country where I had moved to start a new life. It had become the place where my family was growing. The place where our child would learn to walk, to speak, and eventually to build dreams of their own. One night, while watching the baby sleep peacefully, Emily said something thoughtful. "Life looks very different now, doesn't it?" I nodded. Yes. She smiled gently. But in a good way. And she was right. Because every challenge we had faced before, the cultural confusion, the language struggles, the quiet moments of doubt, had slowly led us to this moment. A moment where the future no longer felt uncertain. It felt meaningful. And our story in America was far from finished. In fact, the most important lessons were still waiting ahead. What America really taught me. Sometimes the most important lessons in life are not the ones you plan to learn. They appear slowly, through ordinary days, quiet struggles, and moments that seem small at first. When I first arrived in the United States, I thought the biggest challenge would be language. I believed success depended on learning vocabulary faster, understanding conversations more clearly, and speaking English with confidence. But after years of living here, raising a family, and building a life step by step, I realized something surprising. Language was only the beginning. The real lessons were much deeper. One of the first things America taught me was patience. In the beginning, everything felt slow. Understanding conversations took time. Building friendships took time. Finding stability in work and life also took time. At first, this slow progress felt frustrating. The human brain naturally wants quick results. Psychologists explain that our brains are wired to seek immediate rewards. When progress appears slowly, motivation can drop. But life in a new country teaches a different rhythm. Instead of quick success, progress often arrives in small steps. One conversation. One new friendship. One opportunity at a time. Over months and years, those small steps create something powerful. A new life. Another lesson came from observing everyday kindness. Before moving here, I had imagined America as a very fast and competitive place. And sometimes it is. But I also discovered another side that many people rarely talk about. Small kindnesses. A stranger holding the door open. A neighbor helping shovel snow during winter. A cashier patiently explaining something when I looked confused. These moments might seem ordinary to people who grew up here. But to someone adjusting to a new culture, they meant a lot. Sociologists often say that communities are built through repeated small acts of cooperation. When people help each other in simple ways, trust slowly develops. And trust creates belonging. Over time, the city that once felt unfamiliar began to feel comfortable. The streets became recognizable. The local grocery store felt familiar. Even the coffee shop where Emily and I first met had become part of our story. Sometimes I would sit there again, remembering those early days when everything felt uncertain. Life had changed so much since then. Now there was a child at home waiting for bedtime stories. There were family routines, school plans, and weekend activities. And there was a quiet sense of stability that once felt impossible to imagine. Another lesson America taught me was the value of resilience. Every life contains difficult moments. Financial pressure. Work challenges. Unexpected problems. During those times, resilience becomes essential. Resilience does not mean ignoring difficulties. It means continuing forward despite them. Psychologists describe resilience as the ability to recover after stress or setbacks. It is not something people are simply born with. It grows through experience. Every time a person faces a challenge and continues moving forward, resilience becomes stronger. Looking back, I can see many moments when resilience shaped my journey. The early confusion with language. The loneliness of the first months. The stress of building stability in a new country. Each moment felt difficult at the time. But together, they created strength. Another important realization appeared through family life. Watching my child grow up between cultures was fascinating. At home, there were stories from my background. Outside, there was American culture. Two worlds slowly blending together. Anthropologists call this experience bicultural identity. Children who grow up in multicultural environments often develop the ability to understand multiple perspectives. In many ways, this creates a broader view of the world. Seeing my child move comfortably between these cultural spaces reminded me that identity does not have to be limited to one place. Life can hold multiple influences at the same time. And that diversity can become a strength. One evening, while sitting with Emily after our child had fallen asleep, we talked about the past. "Do you remember the first time we met in that coffee shop?" she asked. I laughed. "Yes. You called me notebook guy." She smiled. "You still write in that notebook sometimes." That was true. The notebook had stayed with me through all these years. But the notes inside had changed. In the beginning, they were full of questions and confusion. Now they contained reflections about family, growth, and gratitude. One page held a sentence I had written recently. "Life rarely changes all at once. It changes quietly, one moment at a time." Emily read the sentence and nodded. "That sounds like our story." And she was right. Because everything that happened, from the lonely nights in the beginning to the warm family evenings years later, had grown from one simple decision. The decision not to give up. And the truth is, many people watching this story might be standing at their own difficult moment right now. Maybe life feels uncertain. Maybe progress feels slow. Maybe the future feels unclear. But sometimes the moment that feels like the end is actually the beginning of something meaningful. And that understanding leads to the final message of this journey. A message for anyone who feels lost. Life has a strange way of teaching its most important lessons slowly. Not through dramatic moments. Not through perfect plans. But through ordinary days that slowly build into something meaningful. Looking back at the journey that brought me here, one truth becomes very clear. There was never a single moment where everything suddenly became easy. Instead, life changed through many small moments. The quiet night when I almost gave up. The confusing conversation at the grocery store. The embarrassing mistake at the library. The unexpected meeting in a coffee shop. The first honest conversation that turned strangers into friends. And eventually, the moment when Emily looked at me and said we were going to have a baby. At the time, none of those moments looked extraordinary. But together, they built the life I am living today. Researchers who study human memory often explain that our brains do not remember life as a smooth timeline. Instead, we remember it through emotional moments. Small turning points. Moments when something shifts inside us. Moments when we decide to continue even when quitting feels easier. Those decisions quietly shape the future. When people watch stories like this, they sometimes imagine that change happens because someone is especially strong or especially lucky. But the truth is usually much simpler. Most people who build meaningful lives are not extraordinary. They are simply persistent. They keep moving forward during uncertain days. They stay curious when things feel confusing. And they allow life to unfold step by step. One of the biggest lessons from my journey in America is this. Belonging is not something that appears overnight. It grows slowly. Through conversations. Through relationships. Through shared experiences that gradually transform a foreign place into a familiar home. In the beginning, I felt like an outsider trying to understand a completely different world. But over time, that world became part of my own story. The streets that once felt unfamiliar became places where my child learned to walk. The coffee shop where I once sat alone became the place where my relationship with Emily began. The quiet apartment where I once questioned my future became a home filled with laughter, toys, and family memories. Life had not changed because everything became perfect. Life changed because I stayed long enough to see the next chapter appear. Psychologists often describe this idea with a simple concept called future orientation. People who maintain hope about the future are more likely to continue investing effort in the present. Hope is not about ignoring difficulties. It is about believing that today's struggles might lead to tomorrow's opportunities. That belief is powerful. It keeps people moving forward when the path ahead looks uncertain. If someone listening to this story is currently standing in a difficult moment, feeling lost, confused, or discouraged, there is something important to remember. The present moment is not the final chapter. It is only a page. And sometimes, the page that feels the most difficult becomes the beginning of the most meaningful part of the story. One day, you might look back at this moment and realize that it was actually the turning point. The moment when everything slowly began to change. That is why the title of this story still feels true. One moment really can change everything. Not because life suddenly becomes perfect, but because a single moment can change the way you see the road ahead. And when your perspective changes, your decisions begin to change. Those decisions shape your actions. Your actions shape your future. Years ago, I sat alone at a small kitchen table wondering if I should give up. Today, I sit in the same city surrounded by a family, a home, and a life that once felt impossible to imagine. All because I decided to try one more day. So if your journey feels difficult right now, remember this. Your story is still unfolding. The moment that changes everything may already be closer than you think. And sometimes, it begins in the quietest way possible. With one small decision. To continue. That decision might not feel dramatic. But it might quietly change your entire life. Here's the truth many people don't realize until much later in life. The moment that changes everything rarely looks dramatic when it happens. It often looks like an ordinary day, an awkward conversation, a quiet decision not to quit. That's how this story began, and it's how many real transformations begin in life. If this story made you feel something, hope, curiosity, or even a little courage to continue your own journey, then this channel is for you. Here, we share real English stories, slow and clear, so you can improve your listening, reading, and speaking naturally while discovering meaningful life experiences in the United States. Remember this, your English can grow, your life can change, and sometimes one small moment can open an entirely new future. So stay curious, keep listening, and keep moving forward. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with someone who might need a little motivation today. Because the next story you hear here might be the one that changes something inside you.